Good morning. In John Newton's letter writing about the moral law of God, he points out two things, two extremes that must be avoided when we consider the right use of God's law. Now, this isn't new, what Newton is saying here, but it is interesting to see him bring out the same distinction and the same dangers on either extreme that can be had with a misunderstanding of the law. He points out on the one hand that it is not a lawful use of the law to seek justification and acceptance with God by our obedience to it. In other words, what he's saying is we need to avoid the extreme of legalism when it comes to the moral law of God. We can't view the law of God as our means to acceptance and justification with God because we're incapable of it. We can't keep the law to a degree that is necessary in order for us to be made right before God. Now that's an insult, he would say, to what Jesus Christ did for us on the cross, what Jesus Christ did for us in living a perfect life on our behalf. Because if we were able, by our own power and in our own strength, to live out a life of full obedience to the law of God, then Jesus' life and Jesus' death would have been unnecessary. And so it diminishes our view of the gospel when we seek to follow the law as a means to gain our acceptance before God. That's what legalism is. And it's important to understand that because a lot of times people throw out the term legalism when what they really don't want to do is obey the law. Legalism is not the same as obedience to the law. Legalism is attempting to obey the law in a way that you believe somehow makes you right in God's eyes, that somehow earns your acceptance by God. That's legalism. Obeying the law is simply obedience, loving obedience when it's done correctly. So Newton says we need to avoid the extreme of legalism. Now, on the other hand, he says the other unlawful use of the law is to pretend that its accomplishment by Christ releases believers from any obligation to it as a rule. In other words, you have legalism on one extreme and you have license on the other extreme. And so he says you have to be careful of those who would claim that because Jesus Christ kept the law on my behalf and because he died to pay the penalty for my failure to keep the law, then I don't need to obey it myself, or I don't need to worry about it so much. Now, this is something that the Apostle Paul dealt with in the book of Romans. He went through the argument for the grace of God and then anticipated the argument of those who would look at that and say, does this mean we just go on sinning because God's grace abounds even more? And he says, of course not. That's foolish. And Newton says the same thing. And the reason, just like with legalism, the reason why license is an abuse of the law is because it diminishes the power of the gospel. To say that Jesus Christ's life and death and resurrection has the power to save us and make us acceptable to God, but it doesn't have the power to change us as well, is to diminish its power. And so, yes, there is an ongoing obligation to keep God's law, not because it earns acceptance, but because it is God's design for us, and because by what Jesus has done for us in dying and rising again from the dead, we now have the power to obey, not just in mere external actions, but through a changed heart, truly desire obedience. I want you to listen to the words of Psalm 119. I'm just going to read this section, today's section that I was reading or listening to in my daily listening. It's verses 33 to 40, and it's under the Hebrew letter Hey. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. That's where we are. Listen to this because I want you to hear as we close the passion of a heart that has been changed by the Holy Spirit that desires to keep God's law, not out of legalism, nor throwing it aside from license, but desires to keep God's law because the psalmist loves the Lord. He says, teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart to your testimonies, and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things, and give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise. that you may be feared. Turn away the reproach that I dread, for your rules are good. Behold, I long for your precepts. In your righteousness, give me life. Have a great day.